What if everything you believe in simply doesn't exist? What if your identity, your history, your thoughts, and emotions are nothing more than an illusion created by your own mind? This idea may seem unsettling at first, but it is precisely what both science and spirituality suggest. Neuroscience, quantum physics, and ancient spiritual traditions agree that the self is an illusion. From an early age, we learn to identify ourselves with a name, a personality, and a story. We say things like, "This is just how I am," or "That's my way," believing that there is a fixed identity within us. Philosopher and writer Alan Watts compared the ego to a collective hallucination, a fictional character we create and that society reinforces. He said we live as if we were a self encapsulated in a skin, separate from the world. However, both science and spiritual traditions affirm that this sense of a solid and independent self may be an illusion. The illusion of self is reinforced by the mind's habit of creating a linear story. Every second, our consciousness receives an avalanche of information and organizes it in a coherent way, so we can function in the world. The problem is that we become attached to this story, believing it defines who we are. Modern neuroscience confirms this idea by showing that the brain does not have a single center responsible for creating this self. Instead, identity is formed by various brain regions working together, gathering memories, emotions, and perceptions to build a sense of continuity. Neuroscientist Anil Seth explains that what we call the self is actually a predictive model created by the brain, a persistent illusion that helps us navigate the world. If the self were something fixed and unchangeable, why do we change so much throughout life? Think about how you saw yourself at 10 years old, then at 20, and how you perceive yourself now. What once seemed essential to your identity may have become irrelevant. The self you identified with in the past no longer exists, and the same will happen with your current identity in the future. The ego is a continuous mental narrative, an inner voice that judges, compares, and clings to a specific identity. But if we can observe this voice, are we really it? If we are not consciously in control of our own actions, who are we, really? What remains when we stop identifying with this collection of thoughts and memories? If our self is just a set of mental patterns, that means we can change it. Neural plasticity gives us the opportunity to reinvent ourselves. This means we are not trapped in a fixed identity, but are instead free to evolve and transcend the limitations we impose on ourselves. If you could observe your own mind in real time, you would discover that your identity is a constantly changing story. Science shows that there is no specific area in the brain where the self resides. Instead, our sense of identity emerges from a complex interaction between memory, emotions, and sensory experiences. The identity we believe we have is a construction of the brain, an emergent effect of multiple neural processes happening simultaneously. Anil Seth, for example, suggests that the notion of a continuous and coherent self is a predictive model created by the brain. In other words, our mind creates an illusion of stability so that we can interact with the world in a functional way. In reality, we are constantly changing and adapting, but our brain convinces us that we are a fixed and permanent someone. Benjamin Libet demonstrated that the decision to perform an action arises in the brain before we are even aware of it. The neural activity leading to a movement occurs fractions of a second before a person feels they have made a decision. This suggests that the self is not really in control as we think, but rather interprets and justifies actions after they have already begun. Patients with brain damage or neurological disorders often report profound changes in identity, reinforcing the idea that the sense of self is not a fixed essence, but rather a phenomenon dependent on brain function. Cases of people with depersonalization disorder, for example, show how the experience of the self can completely dissolve, leaving only the sensation of an empty consciousness observing everything from a distance. If our self is a mental construct, Why do we cling to it so strongly? The answer lies in the very nature of the ego. It is like a character we create and then fiercely defend, even when this identity causes us pain and limitation. The identity we defend so much may be just a temporary phenomenon, a necessary mental construction for our survival, but not an absolute truth about who we are. We hold on to the idea of who we are because it gives us a sense of control and stability. However, this same rigidity leads to suffering. Think about how many times you have felt hurt because someone questioned your worldview, your worth, or your abilities. When we feel that our identity is being threatened, the ego reacts with resistance, defensiveness, or even aggression. Furthermore, the ego keeps us trapped in labels and expectations. If we believe we are a successful person, any failure can feel unbearable. If we identify as good people, we may deny our mistakes and flaws because they threaten that self-image. And what about the need for validation? The ego makes us seek constant approval from others to reinforce our identity. When we don't receive it, we feel insecurity, rejection, and even existential emptiness. Jiddu Krishnamurti said, "Pain exists because we identify with what we are not. By believing that we are only this constructed identity, we distance ourselves from our true essence, that part of us that exists beyond thoughts, labels, and the stories we tell ourselves." In different cultures and teachings, the ego is seen as a barrier to true fulfillment and connection with something greater. In Buddhism, the concept of anatta, non-self, teaches that there is no fixed and permanent self. Suffering arises when we cling to this illusory identity and try to control it. Buddha said, "Attachment to identity is the root of suffering." In Hinduism and the Advaita Vedanta traditions, masters like Ramana Maharshi taught that the ego is merely a temporary reflection of the mind and that, by investigating its nature, we discover it has no real existence. Eckhart Tolle reinforces this idea by explaining that the ego is sustained by psychological time, the fixation on the past and the future. When we connect to the present moment, the illusion of the ego weakens, and we experience a state of peace and presence. But how can we begin to dissolve this identification with the ego in practice? The double-slit experiment demonstrated that subatomic particles can exist in multiple states until they are observed, raising profound questions about the influence of consciousness on matter. Amit Goswami proposes that consciousness is the foundation of reality, rather than just a byproduct of the brain. According to him, we are active participants in creating the world around us. The wave function collapse theory suggests that, without an observer, reality remains in a state of potentiality. This aligns with spiritual teachings that claim consciousness shapes experience. If the universe reacts to observation, could it mean that our perception not only interprets reality but also creates it? The real challenge is experiencing this truth in daily life. Meditation and mindfulness are essential practices. When we meditate, we learn to observe our thoughts without identifying with them. This allows us to see that the mind is constantly creating stories, but we are not those stories. Mindfulness, or full attention, anchors us in the present, where the ego loses its power because it feeds on the past and the future. Another powerful tool is self-inquiry. Ramana Maharshi proposed a simple yet profound exercise. Whenever a thought or emotion arises, ask yourself, who is experiencing this? This question, when asked sincerely and repeatedly, leads to a direct understanding that we are not our thoughts or feelings, but rather the awareness that perceives them. Over time, this practice dissolves the identification with the ego and brings us closer to our true essence. Living beyond the ego also means letting go of the need for external validation. When we stop constantly seeking approval, we begin to act more authentically. This directly impacts our relationships, making them more genuine, as we stop projecting unrealistic expectations onto others. The ego loves to compare, judge, and compete, But by recognizing this dynamic, we free ourselves from the suffering it causes. Overcoming the ego is one of the greatest challenges on the spiritual path. When we transcend the illusion of the self, we experience a sense of unity with everything that exists. Many spiritual traditions describe this state as enlightenment, liberation, or awakening. When we begin to question the solidity of the ego, we realize that we are not the story we tell ourselves. We stop clinging so tightly to our identities, beliefs, and labels, and little by little we start to experience a freedom that once seemed impossible. Without the rigidity of the ego, life becomes lighter. Problems still exist, but we no longer take them so personally. Criticism loses its power, fears fade, and relationships become more authentic. We no longer need to prove anything to anyone, not even to ourselves. The dissolution of the ego does not mean losing individuality or becoming indifferent to the world. On the contrary, it means being more present, more aware, and more connected to life as it truly is. Many spiritual traditions say that it is in this state that we find true peace because we stop resisting reality and simply flow with it. The real question, then, is not who am I, but rather what remains when I stop identifying with the ego. Observe your own experience, notice the moments when the ego manifests, and instead of reacting automatically, simply be aware. And in the silence between thoughts, you may discover something that has always been there, but that the ego kept you from seeing. If this idea resonates with you, try bringing it into your daily life. Observe your thoughts, question your certainties, and explore who you are beyond the stories you've always believed. Life becomes much richer when we realize that we are not prisoners of a fixed identity. We are the very flow of existence, unlimited, free, and aware.